guess we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Gavin Browning. I'm the Director of Events and Public Programs here at the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia, and welcome to this conversation called Kiosk, Copyright, Design, and Digital Culture. I'm pleased to welcome our speakers. Andrew Blum, who is the author of Tubes, A Journey to the Center of the Internet, which, let me give you a visual. This great book, which you can purchase in the back of the room, and I'm sure it gets signed. He is also author of the forthcoming book, The Weather Machine, which is a look at the global machinery of weather prediction. And he has written for Vanity Fair, Wired, New York Times, The New Yorker, Bloomberg Business Week, Architectural Record, among many other publications. We're also welcoming Astra Taylor, who is the author of this great book, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. It's also available in the back of the room. And she is co-editor of the book Occupy, Scenes from Occupied America. She's also a documentary filmmaker and director of the films Examined Life and GSAPP, which is a look at the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. And those are both totally recommended and great. And she's one of the instigators of the Rolling Jubilee, which came out of the Occupy movement and buys and forgives medical and student loan debt, and has so far forgiven over $20 million in debt. We're also welcoming our moderators, Leah Meisterlin, who is term assistant professor at Barnard and Columbia College's architecture department, Barnard, across the street, where she teaches courses on urban praxis. She's a graduate of both the urban planning program and the architecture program here at GSAPP, and she is a GIS cartography expert. She's also worked with the Buell Center on the MoMA exhibition Foreclosed, and has taught here at GSAPP and at NYU. And our fourth panelist is Kazys Varnelis, an architectural historian and director of the Network Architecture Lab here at GSAPP. He leads architectural studios here and teaches courses on network culture. He is the editor of The Infrastructural City, Networked Ecologies in Los Angeles, the collection Networked Publics, and with Robert Sumrall, the book Blue Monday, Stories of Absurd Realities and Natural Philosophies. So, Kazys and Leah are going to begin, and then we'll hear from Andrew and Astra, and then for conversation.
Thanks, Gavin. Although I think we should also add that Leah played a huge role in the Infrastructural City as well.
Yes.
It's got a lot of names in it.
So, thanks everyone for coming. It's really great to have an opportunity to participate in these new lunchtime events that we're having, and to meet Astra and see Andrew and Leah again. Gavin asked me to talk about architecture and phrase this in an architectural context, and I said, well, initially I was thinking, well, but I don't tend to frame these sort of matters in an architectural context, and that always poses a little bit of a problem, because why is that? I mean, if today if the digital is so native to us in certain ways, and it's obviously, I have like 2 of these devices here, another 2 in my bag. We are increasingly, to even say that we're increasingly living in network culture is preposterous. We're immersed in it. There's no news story today that is not engaged with network culture in some major way. Look at Hong Kong. Look at ISIS. These are all questions that have a lot to do with the social networks, with technologies can't be extricated. So, but what about architecture? And then I thought about it, and I was reading this book yesterday and thinking a little bit, and realized architecture is at the heart of so much of this. And if we think of Marx, for Marx in the 19th century, the factory was the signal place of social production. It was also the place in which social relations were reproduced. So, in other words, the factory was not just the place in which capitalists invested money in order to produce commodities, which then, through their ownership of the means of production and through the work of laborers, which then was sold to people to produce more capital. It was also a place that created a kind of new model for society. It was a place that, as the factory developed, became a place that began to instill kind of order for the rest of the world. In other words, we're thinking of, for example, the kind of behaviors that are governed by money relations, by rationality, by abstraction, not just being things that happen in the workplace, but begin to happen in the school, in the home, in terms of relationships between individuals. And so, you know, we think of like whether it's the apartment or the suburban single-family home, the idea of the place one lived in as being determined by rational behavior, by rational consumption, by a kind of focus on production. Again, a single-family house, the relentless production of children. So we can think of you know, there's so much has been written about that. You know, many books have been written on this topic. But what about today? You know, today, if we put aside the old debates about whether we live in a post-industrial society, I think it's kind of clear that the most advanced segments of capital, that is, capitalism in the hands of the most kind of advanced thinking people with a huge amount of money in their hands, is very much happening no longer here in even in New York, but is now happening in places like Weehawken and Mahwah, places where data centers are churning away, places at which, and specifically financial data centers that run high-speed trading algorithms, that are constantly trying to seek little bits of advantage over other algorithms, dueling algorithms operating at a microsecond or millisecond level. If you're interested in this, you know, Kevin Slade, my friend Kevin Slavin, friend of the school, who's now at the Media Lab, has given an incredible TEDx talk on the role of algorithms in our lives, particularly in financial markets. This is having a huge impact on the way that capitalism is operating. It also really changes what capitalism is, because it used to be you might kind of describe it. You know, you'd have capital, you'd invest it in means of production and labor, and then you'd come back with a commodity that would be sold and give you more of that. Now forget about all that stuff. Now it's just capital, algorithms, servers, and just constant churn. It's really it's like mining for Bitcoin, except at the highest level. And let me tell you, if Bitcoin becomes more effective, then they will go to that. And so those data centers that are hidden from us in Weehawken and in Mahwah, those places are very important. And even if they have largely avoided architectural attention, both attention as in they don't want attention, they don't want to be, they don't want you architects to do anything to them. They want to hide, they want to be disposable. They themselves have very short lives and they will churn. They also hide from us. They don't have any desire to appear in our lives. They structure our lives, but they also are not things that want to be celebrated. They don't want to be seen. And of course, those data centers that operate the financial trading algorithms are reflected by other levels of data centers below them, such as the ones that run the cloud, that run media that we're familiar with, like social networks like Facebook and LO, and not to mention sites like Flickr or iTunes, whatever, Netflix. And again, those places are the factories of today. And I think what becomes interesting to me to finish up is to ask ourselves, how is society being reproduced through those places? How are we seeing ourselves as the product of data streams? Think of, for example, the kind of movements of the quantified self that are happening today. Think about where people are tracking themselves with various kinds of devices you can plug into your iPhone to see how many steps you took that day, to see how what you ate that day, and so forth. Versus, for example, the ever-present scary existence of the credit bureau and credit report, versus the final aspect, which would be the world of the NSA and terror and surveillance. How do we operate within that? And I think I think architecture in the end, actually I began as saying maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it really does, because architecture is all about subjectivity. And I would like to finish by saying that I think that these are some of the issues that we'll arrive at today, maybe in some very different ways too. Okay,
We'll dance around that.
Yeah.
I've been asked to contextualize today's topic in the realm with relevance to planning or urbanism more generally. I think, Kazys, you just set me up perfectly to bounce from the scale of the self and individual buildings to urbanism more generally. And in thinking, we can go in thousands of directions if we start from the digital sphere and the internet more generally, but if I think more specifically about the topics or the title of today's talk, and thinking about ownership and copyright and digital culture, and jumping off of what Kazys just said, I think we have to remember that these systems, these structures, or the digital sphere and the internet more generally are they operate as because they are fully formed infrastructures, and with that comes a number of questions about how we societally approach those systems, how we understand those infrastructures to operate, questions of responsibility, who is responsible for those infrastructures, who does own them, who should own them, and the infrastructural questions become a little tricky when we're talking about the space of the internet, the systems of the internet, because there's both, and this is fantastic, I'm so excited to have this conversation, because we're going to be able to talk both about the physical infrastructure, the nuts and bolts, cables, wires, tubes, of that compose the hard, heavy infrastructure that allow the system to operate, as well as the sort of more political or discursive, the digital platforms on which conversation can happen, on which cultural content is produced. And, for planners or for urban thinkers or urban scale thinkers, as well as for policymakers, this raises questions of control of information, control of content. He who controls the platform can control what's contained therein. What that means for democratic and participatory processes, what that means for an informed public in public discussion and the development of policy at the municipal scale especially, as well as traditional questions of urban organization in terms of how labor is organized, right? That we'll certainly discuss, I think, hopefully, with whatever time we've got, we could go on forever, I think, the labor implications, the creation of cultural content, as well as the sort of strangeness of the white-collar, blue-collar dichotomy up until this point. And so we've talked for a while, I think, about a decade more or less, about how digital technologies are reorganizing labor relationships, and we've got some to the extent that we believe that this phrase means anything, the rise of the creative class, the people that implies a corollary blue collar that we rarely remember to talk about. And so that exists in the creation of the content, but that also exists obviously in the maintenance of the physical infrastructure as well. I will, for brevity, I'll stop there because we could keep going, but nonetheless, that digital content and digital infrastructures have, sort of reorganized capital, and in so doing, reorganized urban spaces as capital has do throughout history. This part is new. It's the technology that might be new, but those relationships, I think, are not. So with that, I'm going to time first. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. It's great to do this today. I have been having various conversations about the network and architecture in different ways with Kazys for 7 or 8 years now, and entirely separately with Astra for 10 years or so now. But the two of them don't know each other, and they've never talked before. And this wasn't even my idea, it was Gavin Browning's idea. So it is a kind of excellent coming together of a bunch of these different threads. For me, I come out of architecture. I was a journalist writing about architecture. I still am a journalist writing about architecture. But this shift to this world of the internet came about 6 or 7 years ago now. Kazys' piece about One Wilshire, it's officially called, what is this?
Oh, there are all sorts of pieces I've written about One Wilshire. I mean, probably the one that I like the best is the chapter of Blue Monday that I wrote with Robert Summerall called Ether.
Ether, thank you. not tubes, but.
Also not the cloud, because ether is kind of like something that puts you to sleep, and then when you're asleep, somebody comes and brings a knife, takes part of you away.
Fair enough. But that was that piece about what Wish in Los Angeles was one that I paid very close attention to, and got me thinking very closely about what it would mean to write a book about buildings like this, buildings like One Wilshire. It became more pressing in the sort of 2007, 2008 period as journalism was collapsing and the iPhone was rising, that I was doing two things. I was no longer going out and looking at buildings. I was looking at buildings from, sitting at my desk through my screen. And not only that, but I was looking at my screen all day rather than engaging with buildings, which is what I thought I should be doing as a writer about architecture. And then I was walking down the street and I was looking at this screen that I now carried in my pocket. That action was new at the time, in 2007. When I tried to come to terms with that, I couldn't. There was no world behind the screen. There were rumors of a world, like One Wilshire, but there wasn't a clear picture of the world. Even very early on, I remember trying to figure this out with my editor at the time at Ware, we thought, as the lore has it, that we couldn't possibly trace the conversation we were having between New York and San Francisco because it went many different ways. And to say that it went many different ways was almost the same thing as saying it went no way at all. It went through the ether. That's how we thought about it. The turning point for me came when my internet at home broke. This story is not apocryphal. It's a story I tell a lot, but it is absolutely true. My internet at home broke, and the cable guy came to fix it and followed this clump of wires from behind my couch, out behind my building, and then saw a squirrel running along the cable, and said something which essentially changed my life, which is a squirrel is chewing on your internet, and that's why it's not working. And it was true, the squirrel was chewing on the internet, on my internet, but it became clear in a way that it hadn't, that if a squirrel could chew on that piece of the internet, there had to be other pieces of the internet that squirrels could chew on. Not just the monumental buildings, but many pieces in between. And so rather than, that gave me a very clear framework, which was just to yank the cable from the wall and see how far I could follow it. Because it had to go someplace. Because this conversation that I was having with my editor in San Francisco was actually, we were having, he was there and I was here, and I'd somehow sort of just given up responsibility for believing that could possibly be traced. It was all just, that wasn't going to happen. And as I began to dive into it, the opposite was true. The internet followed far fewer paths than one might expect. The key shift, though, and the key way that I began to sort of construct this exploration of the internet was first to recognize that the internet's made of kind of three different kinds of things. It's made of the logical realm. It's made of bits, of zeros and ones, of programs and algorithms, of things that the vast majority of us do not understand and have a very difficult time accessing anyway. And that yet was the way that we're still asking us to think about it. But if it wasn't only logical, it was also physical. It was made of machines, things you could touch and kick and smell. And it was geographic. It was in places as we are in places in the world. How could it not be geographic? I should add, those are the three ways I was thinking about it. The crucial fourth way for today is the political. Is what forces make it, or however we'll define it. So what I realized is that I was going to ignore the logical as much as possible. I was just going to put the logical aside and focus on the physical and the geographic, on the things that I could see and touch, and on the places that I could go. And that opened up an entirely new way of exploring the internet. It meant that I could be very specific in the places that I went, the people I talked to, that I could stop trying to follow long journeys and instead sort of plant my feet beside the network and kind of watch the bits go by. So rather than sort of constant trace, I don't know if anyone was at the Lines of Nodes symposium a few weeks ago at NYU. the media and culture department, but this wonderful phrase, rather than this infrastructural tracking shot, rather than always trying to follow things through the network, I was going to plant my feet in one spot and stand beside it. A stance that was very familiar to me from writing about architecture. Where that led me was places, most interestingly, was places where the networks of the internet physically connect to each other. About a dozen buildings in the world where more networks physically connect to each other, meaning often with a yellow fiber optic cable from the big router of one network, the network being both a Verizon or a Comcast, but also a Google or a Facebook or a Netflix, to the big sort of refrigerator-sized router of another network. These dozen buildings being the most important because normally about an order of magnitude more networks connect in these buildings than the next tier. So these days that's about 500 or so internet networks connecting physically in buildings like One Wilshire, buildings like 60 Hudson Street in Lower Manhattan, buildings like Telehouse in London, or a bunch of in London, Frankfurt, most notably on the sort of geographic and urban scale, not just these world capitals, but also a couple outliers like Palo Alto, an outlier in all ways except for the internet, or Ashburn, Virginia, an unincorporated suburb near Dulles Airport, but by some measures the single most important point where networks connect. And when you get inside these buildings, for the sake of time, I won't tell you what they feel like, but I will tell you that you begin, but do not end, to understand who owns the networks, because you can see the little white labels on the machines and the signs or the lack of signs on the cages, literally the steel cages in which the machines sit. And so rather than the sense that the internet is this vast amorphous blob, it comes down to a machine. It becomes at 60 Hudson Street. There's a main sort of corridor called Carrier Road that is kind of one of the dominant places where the largest global networks connect. And in the Deutsche Telekom cage, for example, there are on most days 2 German engineers who are making sure that Deutsche Telekom's network in the US is properly taken care of. And then from that cage, there are many yellow cables going up into the ceiling and down into the cages next door that belong to companies like Opto, Cablevision, or like Comcast, or like Google. And so these places, these internet exchange points, places, these buildings, that they do have architecture, we can get to that, but they begin to show the ownership more clearly. However, that ownership is incredibly layered in a way that's difficult to explain. Essentially, it's not necessarily true that the network that owns the dirt is also the network that owns the glass, or also owns the cable that contains the glass fiber, which may be different again from the company that owns the light passing through the glass, which may be different again from the company leasing the bandwidth provided by that light, which may be different again from the person sending the document or movie or whatever it is across, via that light inside the fiber. So we have many, many layers, and that's formulated in the OSI model, a technical term. 0 to 7, thank you. Going crazy for a second. 0 being dirt and 7 being Gmail, basically, with 1, 2, 3 being TCP/IP, 1 being glass. And so that begins to recognize how that there's a logical layer that also has a physical component, and each of those layers might be owned differently, or each individual layer might have multiple owners. And that's something I think we often, it makes it more complicated to understand who owns what, but that doesn't mean each and every piece isn't owned and sold and bought by a variety of different players. And where it gets particularly interesting, I think, or particularly dangerous, is when in fact that marketplace, not just of individual networks connecting to each other, the idea of the internet has to be a network of networks, but those networks are nothing if they don't then interconnect, means that you have a sort of checks and balances with my network is only as good as its connections. It both needs its own internal integrity, but it also has to connect to others, and there's a certain kind of cooperation that inherently has to happen with that. But if a single network, and that happens in both dimensions, that happens both between networks, that happens both in this layering of ownership that I'm talking about. However, if a single network gets too big, that's no longer the case. Or if a single company owns too many layers, that's no longer the case. And we see that most dramatically on the opposite ends, where Comcast owns both everything, perhaps from the content riding upon the wires all the way down to the cables going to people's houses, and then over a vast geographic area with consequences. Or on the other side, and I think even more dramatically, because more difficult to remake, a company like Google that becomes so large that it's no longer a network of the internet, but it becomes its own internetwork. It no longer is about interconnection. It is its own thing. It's not the internet. It's the Google net. That way. For me, and just one way in which the problems with that showed up in my physical exploration of the internet came when I finally, as one of the last places I visited, went to one of Google's data centers in the Dalles in Oregon, and had been at this point to dozens of these places, and for the most part had been welcomed by the engineers with open arms, eager to explain how their piece of the internet works, proud of it, recognizing that this is not knowledge to be held, but rather something that has been built collectively and can be happily shared. At Google, it was the opposite. I was essentially given a tour of the parking lot. We crossed. My press minder looked at my tape recorder very carefully to make sure it wasn't a camera. It was raining, and we crossed all the way across the parking lot. There were like 5 of us with the Google umbrellas to see the Googler's organic garden. But it was like March, so there was just dirt. So here's our patch of dirt. And then they took me to their cafeteria for this delicious lunch and proceeded to tell me how much they all liked working at Google and how many people had applied for their jobs. The disconnect was astounding to me. And I had by this point I had done literally 30 plus of these visits, and everybody seemed to understand what it was and why what I wanted to understand and why. Most notably, a few days before that, Facebook, but not Google, because the general culture is that they will take care of us. That we need not worry about these details. It's in their hands. I should say that has shifted a bit in the last couple of years, and there is a little bit more transparency. But at the time, the culture was so extreme that the Google satellite image of Google's data center in the Dalles was not just old, but was actually rubbed out, was obscured. You already said the phrase once, we'll say it again. Those who control the maps, among other things, have the power, and in this case, that's very clear. So I think that spans both from the ownership of the physical piece, as well as to the political consequences of that ownership and the things that it allows its companies to create.
All right, I'm going to lift off from what Andrew said and talk a little bit about what happens a layer up. I was so fortunate that Andrew was my friend as I was working on this book, because I had somebody I trusted and who'd done so much work looking at the infrastructure of the web, and you're such a supportive friend as I worked on this crazy project, so I appreciate it. So I came to this topic of the internet and technology through 2 angles. So I'm an artist, like documentary filmmaker, musician, and on the other side, an activist. And the activist stuff hooks very well into what Kazys was talking about financialization and the network. Just to give you a quick summary, I'm part of a group called Strike Debt, and one of our campaigns is the Rolling Jubilee campaign, as Gavin mentioned, where we buy and abolish debt on the secondary market. But really, our point is that in this age of neoliberalism and precarity, is the identity of being indebted one that could create new bonds and sort of be, could debt be almost like a poor person's leverage? right? You don't have wealth, but if Americans collectively owe $1.3 trillion of student debt, is there power in that? But it's got us looking at all sorts of things about, the way that predatory lending is a form of wage theft and the enormous power credit reporting agencies, the CRAs, have over our lives. This will come back in at the end. As a filmmaker, I got into this issue when my last movie, Examine Life, was being distributed, and I kind of wanted, it was this moment where you go to these conferences and be like, the web, the old model is crumbling, the new model is so great, build your brand on social media, go forth without gatekeepers, triumph, trust in Google, all is yours, the old broadcast media is dying. And what we've seen is that the old broadcast model hasn't really died. Disney and Time Warner, and these companies are actually bigger than ever, and alongside them have emerged these new digital Goliaths. So the old dinosaurs have kind of adapted to the digital age, and we're seeing the new digital companies increasingly resemble their predecessors. And many of the old problems of the broadcast model have carried over. So consolidation, centralization, commercialism. Those are all still with us. So in a way you could say my book is me asking, well, how does the sort of Noam Chomsky manufacturing consent critique apply in the digital age? How does the Frankfurt School apply in the digital age? How does power operate in a network? When it's not just as clear as, okay, turning on the television and that the, producers are broadcast, it's sort of one-to-many channel, somebody on high telling you what to watch, but rather that you're there feeling as though you're sort of a master of your media destiny, that no one can tell you what to click on or choose, and yet we know that somebody is in control of the algorithms, that some things are given more weight than others, and that we're not as free as some of the techno-utopians would have us believe. So in part my book was a response to the way that artists are invoked in the mainstream technology debate. So I don't know if you've read a lot of the sort of bestsellers, but Lawrence Lessig or Clay Shirky, right? And there was this constant argument by analogy to Napster. And it was like, what's happening to the music industry is happening to publishing, or it's happening to education. There were even pieces, the Napsterization of higher education. And, but my question was, well, what is happening to the music industry? There are still big stars, and are things so great for independent artists? So, I've spent the last year on the road with Nature Book Hotel. I know a lot about the independent music world, and it seems to me there's a lot of complexity to the story that wasn't there. So my book kind of emphasizes the culture industries, not just because that's a position, or that's something I felt I had some experience with and I knew about and cared about, but also because artists were often invoked as kind of examples of where things were headed. Artists are liberated to be free agents online and build their brands, and all of you are going to be next when the robots take your jobs. I also thought that as a documentarian, I could bring something to a particular aspect of the debate, and that was the copyright debate, which is the lens through which a lot of these arguments were presented. And so, a long chapter of my book focuses on copyright and the debate between the sort of free culture camps and the sort of copyright maximalists, the old media guard. And as a documentarian, you're kind of in the middle of this because you can't be so deluded so as to think that you are the sole proprietor of your productions, right? Because you're out there gleaning in the world. You're not a lone genius in your room writing a script and starring and producing it yourself. You're out there trying to find stuff. You often are finding archival footage. You didn't invent the reality or dream it up that you're presenting. And so the role of the cultural commons is very clear to a documentary filmmaker. The fact that you're dependent on this pre-existing world of images and ideas, and that you're giving back to that. So I think documentarians, have a sort of unique position to see both sides in this. And that was driven home to me back in 2009 when my film was coming out. This is sort of my squirrel moment. My movie was about to premiere theatrically at the IFC downtown, and some people had uploaded it, cut it into bits, and uploaded the whole thing onto YouTube. So I was struck this very nice note, and I said, thank you for being interested in my film. That really makes me happy. It's about to be released theatrically. Would you mind taking it down for a few weeks and you can put it back up? And the response was, fuck you, philosophy is free. And then one guy was a bit more subtle and he said, well, what about people in the third world? They should be able to see your film. And there's this confusion that's endemic to this debate, which is free as in speech or free as in price. You know, is philosophy free in the sense that, you know, Socrates, you know, would go around speaking in the streets of Athens and he famously wouldn't charge for his teachings. But my movie was rather, you know, expensive to make. And so that kind of got me deeply involved in this copyright debate. And, you know, I was sympathetic to the uploaders in a sense. And maybe that's because I had made a film about this, you know, a Marxist Lacanian philosopher. But I sort of thought, well, you have a point. This is one of the paradoxes of the internet, is that, you know, the minute that you release something, the minute it's a file, it's there to be, you know, recontextualized, remixed, appropriated, bits of it fly up in all these directions. So as a creator, you know, on sort of immediate level lose a lot of control. But the contradiction is that on the legal level, you actually have more control than ever before. The laws underpinning ownership are stronger than they have been. And experts warn that we are living through what's called the second enclosure. And so this is a reference to the 18th century privatization of collectively managed fields and forests in England, so the enclosure of the commons. So, you know, everything is owned, single notes are owned, right? Every little blip. You know, so as a documentarian, I live in fear that someone's cell phone is going to ring while I'm shooting something, because then what if an automated bot catches that if the film is online and takes my film off the internet, you know, because the bot doesn't understand fair use. So, you know, you're kind of, again, it's like on the one hand, as a creator, you feel like, God, I have no control, these people are uploading my movie, but on the other hand, legally, we're in this, this moment of total overkill and dragnet copyright enforcement. So the very same technologies that are facilitating this sharing, this loosening of cultural ownership, are also facilitating this incredible abundance of ownership. You know, every little click is a copyright event. And there was an interesting article in the New Yorker recently about The Right to Be Forgotten by Jeffrey Toobin, who normally I wouldn't recommend. You know, but it emphasized the way that here in the United States we frame these debates as copyright debates. The issue of what should be online versus what isn't. It's a property question, and in Europe it's much more framed as a privacy and dignity question. You know, what can be shared. So in a way, the fact that I'm fixating on this issue in my book shows my American bias. So my point in the chapter, though, isn't so much that we need middle ground in the copyright wars, even though I do say we need to strengthen fair use and principles like de minimis, and we need, you know, to shorten the terms, because dead people really don't need copyright over their works. But instead I wanted to interrogate this vision of free culture and openness. And well, what if everything was just being shared online? What if I just said, okay, I give up, everything can be free out there? You know, and the argument from the sort of free culture side is that this would create a sort of cultural commons, and we would all be allowed to remix, and there would be, you know, a lessening of control over culture, and this would be a good thing. And you know, what I point out is that just because something is free doesn't mean it's decommodified, especially if advertising is ultimately what's paying for the platform that you're sharing on. And so I point out that while there are these sort of idealists who are promoting this vision of you know, cultural expression and sharing, there are also plenty of Web 2.0 venture capitalists who just see the abundance of all of this content as a way to get rich. So I quote Chris Anderson, who wrote the book Free, The Future of a Radical Price, and he says, just because products are free doesn't mean that it's not possible to make huge gobs of money. And so, you know, the divide here really is between capitalists that make money selling access to content, you know, which would be the traditional record labels, and those that make money by controlling the content distribution networks. That would be like the Facebook and Googles. And the first camp wants scarcity. They want, you know, a regime of total ownership, and the other wants abundance because the more the stuff is shared, the more we're clicking, the more data is collected, the more profits they reap. So for the second camp, looser copyright laws don't pose a threat to them, but actually facilitate, their revenue growth. And so one thing I point out is that, it's no wonder then that these companies encourage this image that we are all DJs and remixers. I mean, those are the like iPod ads, right? We're mashup artists. We're frenetically passing around and repurposing bits of information. Of course, at the same time, these tech companies are like jealously guarding their trade secrets and their IP, and are stunningly opaque and buy up patents like you wouldn't believe. So if you follow these debates, there's been a lot of attention paid to the way that the author was a sort of invention of industrial capitalism. It emerged hand in hand with the printing press and with the development of the market, and the art market in particular, and that the author is a kind of social construct who justifies this emerging economic and technological paradigm. And so my point again is just that the remixer actually is a social construct as well, and that it cannot be disconnected from this moment economically or technologically. Remix culture may possess a rogue transgressive aura, but its methods of appropriation and distribution are perfectly aligned with the profit-making logic of digital capitalism, where originality doesn't pay, but quick aggregation does, which is why we of course have an explosion of sort of Huffington Post style content farms. So the point is that as we know from the old model of broadcast television, that things can be commercialized even if they're free. That's the advertising model. You got to watch television for free because ultimately you were the product that advertisers were paying to access. And that problem just compounds in a digital age. I think what's been absent from this debate about copyright and free culture is an attention to inequality. And the question of who can access a commons, who can access data. So, who reaps the rewards? Let's say copyright was totally eliminated, right? Left unregulated, those companies with market dominance could use the world's creative output without crediting or paying for people to produce it. So, Google and Apple and Spotify wouldn't even have to kick back that tiny little trickle that they now begrudgingly give to creators. And I don't know if you guys are following the discussion about YouTube's new Spotify rival. They're going to do a sort of subscription service. And one of the most fascinating things about that is the way that they're colluding with the old record labels behind the scenes to make sure that all of the revenue streams go to the executives and are named and accounted for in such a way that very little goes to the artists. So the new boss is very much the same as the old boss. I just want to make a few more quick points here. This whole debate about copyright and cultural ownership, I think one of the problems with it is that it's overly focused on access. To me, the question of access gets interesting when you ask, well, who has access? Who is better positioned to take advantage of the trove of data online? Is it me as an individual, or is it Google, which has all this infrastructure and is there to collect it and parse it? But I think we're falling into a trap. Problem is that those who speak enthusiastically about the cultural commons stay safely inside what Karl Marx called the noisy sphere of consumption, where everything takes place in full view. And instead of staying in the noisy sphere of consumption, which is the realm where we're concerned with, well, are you getting paid, or are you sharing it, are you remixing it, are you giving it away? The more interesting thing is the realm of production. That's the hidden abode of production in Marx's phrase. So it's the question of whose labor makes things, right? So just for me, it's the complement to looking at the materiality, the infrastructure of the internet is also looking at the human bodies, the materiality that ultimately creates the stuff that we're interested in. And so one thing I would be frustrated by was the constant invocation of Thomas Jefferson as the ultimate commons guy. He understood that the problems with IP and he who lights his taper at mine shall not be diminished. you know, it's like, well, whose labor allowed Thomas Jefferson to live a life of the mind and give his ideas away? Well, you know, he owned slaves. I mean, there's always somebody has to do the material work, and who's doing that? And to kind of romanticize Thomas Jefferson without acknowledging the whole economy he's embedded in, I think is misleading. So finally today, who's propping up our cultural sphere more and more than before, even in the broadcast days, even in the age of newspapers? It's advertisers. This is where I go back to the activism perspective. I think we should be just as concerned about corporate surveillance, which is advertising and data mining, as we are about government surveillance. I think as artists, we should be very concerned about the fact that we're increasingly told that the way to survive as creators is to partner with brands, you know, and that we've kind of returned to a kind of sponsored content model, which is very reminiscent of the early days of television. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond sort of creative, you know, brand collaborations or whatever euphemism they like to use. It goes beyond just the fact that it's annoying to see annoying ads on the side of your browser. But really, I think what's important is the way that this data collection and mining has the power to increase inequality. And this kind of hooks up with some of the stuff Kazys was saying. All this data is collected. We are, you know, anonymous in name alone, but sorted into different categories. So some, you know, you might get sorted into the fragile families or the burdened by debt category. These are real categories. So let's say you're in or there's a famous one that was the Senate revealed, which was the rape sufferers list. You know, I mean, so they're amazingly, you know, detailed categories. But let's say you're in the burdened by debt list. You know, that means that maybe you will be given a higher interest rate on a loan, or you know, there will be some sort of price discrimination. You'll be actually, you know, has to pay more because somebody will go, okay, you're probably pretty, you know, cutting it pretty close, and you really need this to survive, so we're going to price gouge you at this moment. And these are things that have been documented. The FTC and the White House have both issued white papers warning that this kind of data collection is opening up new avenues of housing discrimination, credit discrimination, employment discrimination. And there was a recent horrible example of this. Has anybody heard of starter interrupt devices? See, there's a recent article in the Times about the fact that auto lenders are now installing network devices onto people's cars, and that if you're a day late on your auto payment, they can just make it so you can't start your engine, right? They turn off your car. So, you know, what this does is it enables them to give riskier loans, to basically, in effect, give predatory auto loans at really high interest rates, because they're confident that they can just turn the engine off and, you know, force you to come up with the money to pay. So there were stories of, you know, people trying to take their kids to the hospital and they couldn't start their car because they had to find $350 for the auto payment or whatever. So to go back to the issue of ownership, I think this is where it gets really interesting. So all the ambiguity around cultural objects, who owns a cultural artifact, a movie online, what happens, what's the difference between streaming something versus downloading an MP3? You know, when you're streaming something, you don't own it. You're embedded in all of these licensing agreements, and things are really complicated. That's going to happen more and more for physical objects. You know, ownership, I think, will get increasingly complicated. And you see a little hint of that in this example of these cars with these starter interrupt devices. And you know, what are the sort of social consequences of that? And also, where are progressives? And why aren't they talking more about this in the way that these technologies can erode hard-won consumer protections and have the potential to, you know, increase inequality and have, you know, very dire consequences for people. So in my modest way, I hope that, I hope that this book can be a way of kind of getting a sort of progressive consciousness into this debate, or amplifying the one that's already there, and looking at the way that ownership is going to become more complicated, and who benefits and who loses.
I could, unless you want to go.
Ready?
Okay. I guess the question I have is incredibly broad, but at the same time, after hearing all three of you, it also seemed like one that we should just get out right away, which is, the thing that was so compelling about Astra's book is there's so many of us are writing about digital culture today and the problems with it, but you actually have some solutions. And I thought that was kind of like, whoa, unique. Because there are not a lot of those. I mean, there are, but they all tend to be couched within more of the same. Like, for example, Chris, and maybe this is where we could begin, and also tie in to Andrew's book as well, is that so Chris Anderson, the editor of Wired, who wrote the book Free, also wrote a book called The Long Tail. And in The Long Tail, he describes how although there are these giant aggregators like iTunes, Netflix, odd within this group, it's still iTunes, Netflix, Amazon, and these so on. That these markets, if you will, make a great deal of money, of course, from their big hits, like the next Miley Cyrus album, or the next Avengers movie, whatever it is. And yet, Chris Anderson said, isn't it wonderful that half the money that these companies get is from the long tail? So basically, the long tails, Anderson looked at the kind of graphs that these that emerge in these kind of aggregators, and they basically form a kind of exponential graph. And so a huge number of the hits, a huge number of the amount of money goes to the hits. And this is something that he and Clay Shirky and other theorists at NYU have described as scale-free networks, and they say, basically, this is good. This is the way the market at work. And I find that this is kind of one of the most insidious aspects of the network today, is that we're taught that inequality is just great. It's natural. It's where to have like one blog become incredibly popular is normal. That's what we should expect. We should expect that Google and Facebook are going to be the most visited sites, right? And that's kind of Shirky's just like, it's natural. He's kind of neoliberal apologist. Now, Anderson was kind of more interesting, because Anderson said, yeah, but what happens to the other 50%? That's the long tail. And there are people, who are in various positions on the long tail, and they can make money off of that. They can survive off that. So if you have, he said, 1,000 people who buy your product, because let's say you're a musician, and they religiously buy your product, you can make a living off of it, as long as you obviously put out enough product. Interesting argument. I did at the time when Anderson lectured back in at a group I was running at USC back in 2003, I said, but what about the aggregators? They become so incredibly powerful. And he said, well, there'll always be another Google, Then it turned out, and that was in an era where Google is still pretty new, and now it turns out those aggregators aren't swapping out that often. Anyway, so both a statement that I'm adding to this and a question, and the question would be then, so in the end, the problem is that the long tail doesn't work that well. It kind of works, but not too well. And it's very difficult to survive in the long tail. And in a lot of the long tail, you can't make any money unless you're a trust fund kid, or you have, or you're working some kind of day job. Probably add the term crushing day job to that. And especially if you're burdened by huge amounts of debt. So I think there are a lot of problems with the long tail model, and I think that Astra had pointed out some issues about inequality and how we might be able to deal with them, as opposed to just mentioning them. Leah, I know you've thought about this a lot, and so I'd like you to talk about it in your own way. And Andrew, I think what becomes interesting too is you also talked a bit about, you were kind of hinting at a question that 10 years ago had first surfaced, which is a question of net neutrality. And you were actually talking about that a little bit with Comcast. And it's turned out it's still there, and it's like we can't seem to overcome it. So if that makes sense for you, maybe those are all things we could start off with.
Can you just narrow the neutrality
So
slightly?
for you, net neutrality. So what can we do about net neutrality, and what are the problems?
The solutions still, okay.
The solutions, and also what's so dangerous about Comcast owning it. I guess it's obvious what's so dangerous, but there also are real effects as to what happens when Comcast owns everything, or Verizon owns everything.
So I'll put aside slightly some of the more general basic net neutrality arguments and just sketch my dream which is somewhat bizarre and may not be a solution, but I think it's worth discussing. Around the corner, on one of the many storefronts shifting in and out in my neighborhood, there was one that opened up and they put a sign on the big glass window that said neighborhood in appropriate era typography. And I couldn't wait to see what was going in underneath, because it was like, I mean, neighborhood what? And what I really hoped was going underneath, and which is not going to happen, but would be neighborhood data center. Like, I think it would be really interesting if somebody opened up a neighborhood like IT department where you could go and they would store your email there, and your cloud would not be off in Oregon and belong to Google, but your cloud would be more on the scale of your dry cleaner or bookstore. And if you had a problem with your systems, you would go and the nice person behind the counter would help you with the systems, and if you had a connectivity problem, they would go jiggle the cable in the back of the store. Rather than the sense that anything we build having to do with the internet has to scale so that we can make billions of dollars off of it, there's a notion that we've adopted in other realms, like food most notably, of the benefits of local control and of local production. And I think that the sort of preposterousness of that notion of a neighborhood data center is indicative of the extent to which we're entrenched in this idea of the internet being an amorphous global thing run by global corporations, which is what net neutrality ~maybe pretends to legislate against. I should say that the phrase net neutrality does not appear in tubes. The reason for that is it never came up with, I probably should have acknowledged it. I was somewhat stubborn about not acknowledging it. But the reason is that it never came up among the network engineers because it existed in Washington. It didn't exist in these data centers. The place where I saw the most activity and the biggest challenge towards to the freedom of the internet was in the connections between networks, this process known as peering. In Tim Wu's and Lawrence Lessig's formulation net neutrality, the word peering never appears, so I feel somewhat even about that. The idea of peering and of legislating the interconnection rather than just legislating the sort of passage and the throttling of bits across a single network is beginning to enter the conversation with the FCC now. But fundamentally, every time I've tried to get any purchase on the net neutrality issue, I've kind of recoiled in horror, either because a lot of the kind of events and think tanks are very explicitly funded primarily by Google. The New America Foundation is one of the great proponents of net neutrality. Eric Schmidt is the chair of the board. If I were a journalist writing about an environmental issue and the chair of Exxon were the chair of one of the major funders, I would say this is crazy. But somehow, for reasons we have been talking about, that gets a pass. The last straw for me, when I realized that perhaps I didn't have a solution for this other than my ludicrous local data center idea, was when I asked about this peering question to a major net neutrality activist, and he handed me his business card with his Gmail address, and I said, there's no way I can begin, I can't do this. And so I started writing a book about the weather. It's my solution.
Oh, did you from there?
Please.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, the issue of who's funding a lot of internet activism goes beyond net neutrality too. I mean, I think it enters the debate in terms of like privacy and like the total understandable emphasis on government surveillance and stuff like that, but the corresponding like de-emphasis on issues of corporate use of our personal data and all sorts of other areas as well. I kind of accepted the net neutrality debate as something that was very important and talk about it in the beginning of my book. But my question is, okay, even if we had a neutral network, which we don't, but even if we did, it wouldn't be enough. That wouldn't be enough to create a democratic equitable internet. In part because what we see on top are, is a tendency towards these info monopolies. So as you just said, there are these gatekeepers online, and they've been kind of remarkably stable over the last few years. So, and then there's also this question of the long tail. So, not just that there are these platforms that we are, all familiar with and depend on, but also that there's a kind of process of virality where the big gets bigger, where scale is irresistible, to use Andrew's word. Whether you're a platform or whether you're a content creator. And Eric Schmidt has a kind of. Eric Schmidt is a man of like really scary quotes or just really incisive ones. And there's, his response to Chris Anderson's long tail was, I wish there was, but there isn't a long tail. What we have is bigger brands, bigger stars, global phenomenon. That's the world that we're moving towards. And like all of you people romanticizing in the long tail are totally missing the boat, because it's actually about the fact that the big can get bigger, that the global is now in everybody's reach. I think what's interesting is it's not just considered normal that a few people could win the kind of viral lottery. I mean, it's like not just accepted as part of the landscape, but I feel like people think that's actually what democracy is and what cultural democracy is everybody can put their hat into the ring and a few people get to win. And so that's one thing I challenge in the book is, well, what is a more democratic culture? Does it mean that everybody has a chance to win the lottery, or that there's a more even distribution of outcomes? And I think it's the latter. I think a much more interesting phrase than the long tail is the missing middle, which is a phrase from Matthew Heinemann, who's a political scientist who wrote The Myth of Digital Democracy. And the missing middle is something we see in a lot of aspects of our society and our economy, right? The missing middle class, and the missing middle in publishing or in all sorts of cultural industries, and you definitely see it in YouTube hits or whatever. There's lots of things with only, what is it, like 90% of tweets go unretweeted, and then there are some that get retweeted millions of times. So I think the missing middle is something to pay attention to. And how do we bolster it? And I do offer some solutions in the book, but I feel like I just began that conversation in part because my editor kept telling me I don't need to be prescriptive. That I was allowed to just write a book that was completely critical and negative and laid out all the problems. I think I think there's a lot of it has to be done offline. It's about investing in institutions that can support work that might not otherwise go viral or might not otherwise find a huge audience. One thing I look at is, investigating what public media might look like in a digital age. An early conversation with Andrew said something that was really striking to me. He just said, "There's no such thing as a public internet." And I was somebody who's very attached to public media, maybe because I'm actually secretly Canadian. But I was like, why? Why is there this assumption that public media has no space? And could that be one avenue for strengthening the middle? I was just talking to my friend Miranda here about the way that algorithms might actually be able to do that, the way you might actually be able to engineer things that curb winner-take-all tendencies. So there might be technological fixes too. That would require some sort of discussion in civil society about what that would look like. I feel like the answer to any sort of algorithmic intervention is like that. Oh no, we don't want we don't want platforms to be any more paternalistic. But the point is, they're already extremely distorted. They're already, serving the needs of advertisers and shareholders. They're not neutral by any stretch of the imagination. The word platform is totally misleading because it kind of implies everything's coming up on an even level. So, could we counter those values somehow? I think that's really interesting. So, those are kind of general areas that I look at.
I think I will. Okay, I'll respond with a follow-up question, actually, for the two of you that may just ask you to get a little bit prescriptive for fun's sake, we'll say, or speculative. When in thinking about the question and the prompt, the question about the long tail and the missing middle and the basic fundamental problem with the math when we talk about that, the long tail graph, that whether or not that tail exists, it's rapidly and asymptotically reaching zero. And pretty much you continue to draw the graph even though the value is zero. Zoomed out far enough, the long tail seems like a fantastic sort of economic turn when we're looking at the scale of the nation, the national economy, that so much can be produced and that it can be spread so wide. But once you zoom into the level of the individual or the household or the neighborhood or a certain class of worker, dividing that very little up becomes, is essentially creative and financial suicide. And so it's a problem of scale, I think, which brings us to if the content that is produced along that tail, the ideas that are produced along that tail, if there is cultural value to it, if there is absolutely social value to it, if it's throughout that tail that we are sort of socially reproducing ourselves, or our society is reproduced, and if there is space within that tail that requires that sort of activity and those sorts of functions, then we come back to the sort of responsibility of the commons, or the purpose of the commons, and why I sort of continually insist on framing this, or at least for myself in my own thinking, reminding myself that I have to think in infrastructural terms, right? Because these are systems and networks upon which, by definition, we are all reliant, that from which we all benefit, that we, collectively, societally require for our own reproduction, and thus this question of the extent to which we are collectively responsible for its maintenance, collectively responsible for the continued maintenance of, or the continued production of that content. I know, Astra, you mentioned in the book the extent to which, or you sort of instigate toward public financial responsibility for creative content generation. If the dominant mode of distribution is going to be price-free, not necessarily thought-free or speech-free, but price-free sharing. If by producing and collectively sharing, we're all sort of willingly consenting to being turned into free labor, right? Or that the data we generate is our labor. If that's the way creative production is going to operate, then we must sort of ask ourselves, what is our collective responsibility and how do we fund that? And ultimately, if you're me, that leads you to the conclusion that we need policy, like severe policy intervention, and it becomes a question of public action. So I'm going to follow up with sort of, when I start to think, I like to reduce it down to familiar analogies, right? And for me, one of the useful analogies in discussion is thinking about the digital infrastructure and the sort of unseen physical infrastructure, the hidden physical infrastructure of the internet, in terms of familiar infrastructures that are strangely non-public in the United States, at least. I think we're comfortable with the idea that our government needs to supply roads and transportation, basic transportation infrastructure, that we publicly supply social infrastructures like education and prisons, I suppose. But that we have regulated private markets for other infrastructures. And I think a good analogy here is our energy system, whereby legally we separate modes of production, producing energy versus distributing energy because of the implied sort of heavy physical infrastructure and the natural monopoly that's involved, and in order to sort of avoid what you very sort of terrifyingly describe as a pure vertical monopoly over the system. I guess my follow-up question there is in moving towards something that is more public, as distinct from social, but capital P public, moving toward a system that would support equitable growth of itself and of us, and maybe a more democratic content and democratic distribution. Are there sort of lessons, regulatory and not, are there corollaries that you can glean from the way that we regulate our infrastructures?
Well, I guess what's interesting with the internet is that the regulations exist to prevent, in many places, to prevent the rise of new local networks. So new local networks are prohibited. You cannot build a municipal broadband network by law, essentially quite explicitly because of the political power of the cable monopolists. The places where that has allowed, where those laws don't exist, or other municipal broadband networks have sprung up. The municipal broadband, I think, is a really important phrase because it implies a scale, a municipal scale, a city scale. And I think that smaller piece is really crucial. Just as the municipal is mostly where we deal with transit, but it's not where we deal with power. I think the internet does have to be at a smaller scale. I mean, the shining example, the really astonishing example is Chattanooga, Tennessee, that had a publicly owned utility company, a sort of New Deal era Tennessee Valley Authority offshoot called the Electric Power Board, EPB, that realized in the 90s that their mission was, their corporate mission was to serve their customers first, and why don't they provide broadband services as well? And it took them a decade, but they added fiber to the lines that they bring to every single building in their service area, because they're the power company. They serve every single building, and are now offering, I've lost track because they keep dropping the price, but I think it's now a gigabit of service, which is to say somewhere around 20 times what Comcast might give you for, I think it's like $50 or $60 a month, more than you really need, but still kind of fun to play with. And their answer is, this isn't so hard. This is not rocket science at all. And all of the kind of things, oh, it's too big a country, and all of these kind of reasons that we can't do this begin to evaporate. And there are amazing consequences. I went to their network head end, the place where EPB's, Chattanooga's gigabit fiber network connects to the rest of the internet. And there's a box there, literally a box, that Netflix gave them, because rather than clog the regional or the connection from Netflix to their network, Netflix says, why don't you keep most of our movies locally, and that way you'll have them, and our customers win and you win, and there's both no service degradation. Netflix doesn't buffer, nor is there a traffic issue. This is the technical solution, and precisely the technical solution that some of the Netflix disputes between Comcast and Verizon that have been in the news deliberately avoid, because it very clearly erodes their broader business model, and because it competes in other ways. So the technical solutions are completely simple, but the reason you can't have municipal broadband in lots of places is because it's illegal. And the movement to change those laws is growing. I just read New Haven, Stamford, and Hartford are building municipal broadband networks. New York City is not. It's a sort of very secret of the Bloomberg era that he didn't touch it. There was an embarrassing moment at Columbia Cure Symposium last fall where the outgoing director of information technology, Rachel Hode's title was, but trumpeted the wonderful New York City program to help small business owners in Soho get fast broadband access, as if Soho were some far-off village. So literally, they're like, we have helped. We have given grants to 10 businesses in Soho to help them with their broadband access, which would be the most humiliating statement I can imagine for improving broadband service. And it remains to be seen if de Blasio touches it. It has to happen at some point, but at the moment, everyone's just pretending like this isn't an issue for New York.
Yeah, I think you cannot overestimate, or just, you cannot say enough that the fact that we don't have municipal broadband alternatives is because in 20 states, I think it is. It's illegal thanks to incumbent cable company lobbying. So they've spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single town. It's not conspiracy theory. It's announced explicitly.
Yeah.
I mean,
they sort of say we've succeeded in preventing this from happening.
Yeah. So you have more choice.
Right.
So I think, that's fascinating, but it's like what happens what happens on the next layer, and could there be more proactive media policy? So I think what's interesting about the net neutrality debate is it's government intervention, but it's still like, you can't do this. You can't, it's framed as you can't provide an internet fast lane. The government has been involved in, media efforts like creating the post office or creating public television that were more proactive. And those are, off the table in part because of just the political, ideological times we live in. Also because the myth of the internet, going back to the declaration of the independence of cyberspace is, government, you have nothing to do here, we come from cyberspace and you cannot mess with us and you don't understand us and, go away. And that the state moves too slowly to catch up with technology. The irony of that, of course, is that, so much of the technology we take for granted was subsidized by the state, at least in terms of its R&D. Microchips and the internet itself and touchscreens and all this stuff. So there's a lot that's sort of erased. So yeah, I do try to make an argument for public funding. And one thing I don't mention, I don't think I mentioned in the book, but I find it really striking is there's an article co-written by the founders of Google from '98 where they talk, and they're still at Stanford back then, and they talk about how advertising finance search engines are inherently biased, and we really need an academic alternative. And so they're making the strong case that a search engine should be independent of advertising mandates. And I think nothing sort of encapsulates our moment better than that. The fact that they've given up on that dream, and yet they are investing heavily in life extension. So, which is to say that humans living forever seems more possible than having a public search engine. And I think that is, neoliberalism at its purest. That's the moment we're living in. I don't know, but I think that's the direction we need to go. I think that we need to make good on these metaphors we use when we talk about the internet. When we talk about the internet as a library or a town square or an archive, and that the internet is not those things because of the way it's financed, and it can never be those things, and will be less and less of those things because of how it's financed. So I think the public option needs to go on the table. We need to go back to that 1998.
But I would add that it doesn't. It's not those things now, but it absolutely
could be
because of the just basic notion of a network of many networks. I mean, it can constantly reinvent itself. That's embedded in it as long as one doesn't get too big.
Yeah, and I think that's why this is actually kind of interesting moment because there's so much cynicism about the internet as a surveillance machine. And the thing is, I think Andrew's exactly right. Well, it could be lots of things. It depends what human beings decide to do and what we make of it. And there are countries going in different directions than the United States. It's important to look at those as well.
Yeah. So when I think of everything you all are saying, is that I was making some notes to myself, and I was remembering that an encounter I had last year at a symposium at Parsons with Rachel Law, if you're familiar with her work. And she's this brilliant thinker who, unfortunately now, if you Google Rachel Law, it comes up with Rachel's Law, and it's kind of a disaster. But if you go to, I think it's Interface Foundry is one of the websites that she has. She's a graduate of the design program at Parsons, and she co-wrote a book with Mackenzie Wark that was on weaponized adorables. That's pretty amazing. But she came up with an idea that I think could maybe be the basis for one way to think about this, and you said some of these metaphors like town square, which is the idea of the neighborhood. And the idea that in her model, what if you had something like a data bubble that could be on the internet or could be in mesh networks, and that would involve information in particular to a certain kind of place. So for example, let's say you are holding a symposium, you might create a data bubble that might have various information regarding that symposium that could exist in some way. And I think that rather than describing it, one could imagine various different ways of it existing in an area, maybe for a time, maybe permanently, or maybe just for a time, depending on whether you have dedicated servers, or it could even be something that could exist on a number of different devices all at once. And that brings to mind, some thoughts. One is, if you ever, when you log on, when you're somewhere looking for a network, you pull down your little menu and you see all the names of networks, and once Once, I was somewhere and it was like, one of the networks was, God damn it, Joe, get out of my parking spot, or something. It was, sometimes you see those, and I wondered, what if we could take that idea of the free network, the local network, and turn it towards some kind of local public. Public doesn't always have to be the entire country. It can be a local phenomenon too. Could you have local networks that might offer certain kinds of tools, information, places to meet people, let's say, to talk about things? I think, for example, of when we had our own not only internet outage, and my neighbor had been electric outage after the last hurricane, how our whole neighborhood came together and actually has stayed together. And what if there were other tools for that besides using cell phones and so forth? What if there are tools that might be locally based, that might be based on networks that might resemble maybe more the old bulletin board systems, the BBS systems of the 80s. I'm old enough to have used these. And these kind of networks that were often run by hackers that may or may not have really been connected to the internet, that may have had illegal stuff on them, but may have been a lot of pretty interesting venue to look to play in. They may not be a broader public yet, but I think they offer some kind of other alternative to, say, a world that is thoroughly dominated at this point by capital. So that's one thought. And then the other thought that I just had to offer is that yes, in terms of policy, when I think of our own timidness with regards to policy, and particularly the timidness of our political parties towards policy, is that 100 years ago, 50 years ago, people wouldn't have thought twice about such matters. In fact, AT&T, which was broken up by not only it was repeatedly the target of breakups, and was finally broken up by one of the most officially conservative administrations of the era, the Reagan administration. Also the Carter administration tried to break it up because of the dangers of that monopoly. And in fact, what it was doing the reason the Reagan administration broke it up was because they felt it was holding back the development of telecommunications. Things like antitrust law, which was developed about 100 years ago, specifically to deal with AT&T and Standard Oil. It was not something that only the left, that was really the pride of the left. It was something that, that kind of progressive thought was something that capitalists themselves thought was to their advantage, because capitalism, unless you are insanely rich to begin with, if you're the most mercenary capitalist, you want to have some kind of playing field you have possibility in. And if you have no possibility in it, then it's not going to work out. So such laws were passed not necessarily from a left position, but from a kind of confluence of different interests. And I think that we need to, just kind of just continue to make efforts to bring up these issues of policy and say, these are things we need to deal with, and find ways to be inventive about it, and not be very timid about it, because I think that that's something that our society is doing, is being very timid towards questions of policy.
I think that, I'll make one quick wrap-up comment, because I see a threat with implications for architecture and planning, city, the concrete, physical world. And then I don't know if we want to open up questions or just sort of milling any books and signing and that sort of thing. But but I think there are so many things one could say, but I think one wrap-up comment and one sort of speculation on a way toward even in that playing field or devising equity in the platform, both in the distribution and the distribution system and the content generation, comes back to this question of place. We've talked about scale, we've talked about municipal scales versus the national scales, and this idea, this myth that, or the argument that public intervention has no place in the internet, I think is largely rooted in this myth that the internet has no bounds or doesn't exist. Is of a different geography, right? That the geography by which political boundaries are confined, the jurisdictions are confined and defined, that the rule of law exists within certain geographic bounds, and that the internet does not cares not for those bounds and doesn't have to respond to them, and exists in a fully different sort of geography. And I think that we're coming to a point where that's becoming increasingly seen as untrue, which may be an opportunity for an opening of the discussion. You know, Andrew, from your work and your research, sort of really sort of painting the picture of concretely placing the systems in certain locales to you know, the rise of geolocational technologies and all of our devices, to remind that in real time at various scales links us from the sort of digital sphere onto the ground through our experiences. That may open up, I think, avenues for a conversation that, because it's geographically located, because it happens somewhere, that somewhere is in a regulated space, like it's a part of a certain public, part of a certain sort of jurisdiction, right? There are jurisdictional oversights possible. I know we're supposed to, you want to say?
Oh, I just want to say, I wonder if seeing the internet as a placeless thing is very American, though, right? Like, because you know, there are definitely people in Europe and in other countries saying,
I think so.
you know, that there's a kind of cultural imperialism at work through the net. So, you know, it might be a sort of privilege of the place we're situated in, to see it as something that's neutral and,
or it may just be allow us to deny the imperialist component if we say it's not of a place, if it's not of a state, if it's not of a specifically located culture, then how on earth can we call that imperialist as it spreads?
That was wicked. One of the other reasons I really love the term ether is that for Hart and Negri, I think there are a lot of problems with Hart and Negri, but I think their analysis in Empire was really great, and they looked at. You know, they said on the one hand there is no country that dominates. On the other hand, clearly the U.S. does dominate empire, and that it does so through three ways: by being the focus of money that is obviously located in New York and Wall Street, the bomb, which the power of D.C., and then ether, which is the power of the network and the media, which they located in L.A. Interesting, but so that is that ether isn't something that is common to everyone. But rather, it does specifically have origins and have origins in power. And one thing that we haven't talked about very much, and in terms of being the property of the U.S., is something that the U.S. seeks to survey and seeks constantly to survey. And you know, the Snowden, whether it was Snowden or before that, you know, the various other revelations that happened before then, thinking of WikiLeaks. This, you know, the amount of surveillance that's going on in this country on the net is phenomenal. And if you look at who owns the net, in many cases you point you do a couple of hops away, and you get to usually one hop away from a corporation that has a lot of dealings with enterprises like the CIA. The DOD, there we are as well. So questions?
We have 5 minutes for democracy.
So I guess to play a more pessimistic role, perhaps, Leah, you argued that maybe the physicality of the internet is becoming more obvious. I suppose.
Capitalized, italicized, maybe, but
right,
yes.
maybe. I wonder if, you know, to me it seems like there's a big problem with awareness. In part, the U.S. is different than Europe. Germany has been involved with the Amazon litigation, things like that. But here as well, I see artists and other young people who really don't understand all the hidden stuff. The trace of the money or the trace of the physicality of the network. And I'm constantly surprised by people my age who have no idea how Google makes money off of their email. It's sort of the most obvious point. Or you know, even myself, when the Spotify released, you know, people started studying what artists make off of Spotify. It's sort of surprising even to me how little artists make from that. So I wonder if you could comment on sort of awareness, which seems to me to be the biggest issue in sort of getting the public to react to it. People see a lot of benefits in what the internet has created. They don't see themselves as products of how those companies make money.
Their data is product. They're the producers, is the strange part. They don't see themselves as labor, working for those companies, right? You want to go first? Go ahead.
I mean, it's been thrilling to see how much over the last 3 years or so the recognition of the existence of data centers has sort of entered the conversation slightly more. I mean, the Snowden revelation has been a long way towards that, because you can't, if you're going to tap the internet, you have to find a place to tap it, and that was a lot of. I mean, it was totalized. I mean, in the expansiveness of the surveillance, we got back to that amorphousness. It wasn't, there were points. It was actually, I think, in places like Germany or France, it was more precise, and there it was more about infrastructure than it was here, because again, here it was sort of too big to grasp. So I do think that there is more recognition in the last few years. But I'm coming out of a sort of 18-month period of utter disgust and with Silicon Valley, and I'm sort of reaching a sort of slightly milder sense that we do not, our decision to use these free services is not as naive as I thought it once was. That in fact, the bargain of what we're getting in exchange for what we're giving, we're entering into quite maturely. And yet what's being offered is often so good that we are happily giving up privacy for it, and that's not. I mean, I see that in my own choices, and I think that there's still distinctions to be made. I thought what Apple announced a couple of weeks ago, where they basically said, we make our money selling these things, not selling you, full stop, was kind of amazing. I think the awareness is coming, and I also think that that this success of the network companies in all forms at building a future that I remember, that 5 and 10 years ago seemed like it was going to take a lot longer than it's taken, has to be acknowledged as well. I mean, I think about bus time, the MTA system that tells you when the bus is coming. I mean, this came fast. It's open data. It depends on the private networks. The money we pay to AT&T and to Apple and to whoever else. But it changes transit, and it's come a lot sooner than I would have thought. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would see the bus on the map,
I just want to speak to the awareness question. I mean, I think it has, part of it is that, part of why I made the analogy to the Noam Chomsky and Frankfurt School is like, I sort of knew where to go, or when I was a young person wanting to become, be an independent media creator, I was influenced by people who were critiquing the media. And I wrote my book partly as a response to the fact that all I could find were these books that were the bestsellers that are like, everything is great, here comes everybody, we are empowered online. Or a kind of nostalgic thing of the internet's making us stupid. So I feel like we've wasted a lot of time when we could have been raising awareness or continuing these critiques that are still relevant. Just the technology hasn't rendered them totally useless. So part of it is that I think the critics drop the ball a bit. I also don't think. But I think the conversation has come a long way. I mean, just for me, even from when I started working on the book, I think just the general awareness has really increased. And you don't need everybody. I think in the model Andrew's talking about, where it's like, okay, well, we're all knowingly making these decisions to give away our data. I think they want us to feel like that individually, well, it's really up to us. I have an iPhone and I use Google, and it's me and my choices. And I think we need to say, we actually just need a small number of actors to influence policy and create some good privacy regulations. We shouldn't all have to be feeling the weight of all of these individual choices and tweaking every privacy setting, and then the company changes their terms of service. And it's such a pain in the ass. So it's like you don't need everybody. You just need a small number of concerned citizens who are gonna advocate around these issues to get some traction. And considering the amazing might of these corporations and like how deep their coffers are, I think they are feeling the heat. And the last few years have kind of scared them, which is part of why they're spending so much more money lobbying Washington than they were a few years ago. So that doesn't bode very well. But yeah, I'm not feeling totally pessimistic.
I mean, one of the places that I could feel optimistic about, happen to have guardedly optimistic, is the university. I mean, and educational institutions as places in which we teach here really have a mission to not abandon the project of critique, but rather extend it towards the world we live in. I mean, if you look at so many syllabi, if you were to look at syllabi in contemporary theory or contemporary culture, so many of them are still using tools, if you will, that may have been brilliant for the 1970s and 80s, but that really don't work for today. I mean, that they do at some level, but we live in a different world, and we do need to engage with it. And in that extent, I think there has been a bit of dropping the ball, and in part it's also because of, the university itself isn't neutral, and the universities have moved very much towards a model in which they themselves see cash. Universities see themselves as producing startups, as being in the business of producing startups, as having, and then, like, for example, this new land grab that is just starting to fail the way it did at Columbia 15 years ago, which is the MOOC. The MOOC, which was kind of created here long before I got here. It didn't really work in this project that was done 15 years ago. Now, everybody tried it again. It's now not going to work. But the MOOC is a great example. But there are even the idea, of that students, rather than, it used to be that the knowledge we were produced here was supposed to be producing knowledge. It was producing, new ideas and intelligent ideas, not just, dumb ideas. But now, now it's about sellable ideas. And universities are very interested in that. Coupled with that, on the other side, is universities themselves are also seeing, who runs universities, boards of trustees, who is on boards of trustees, very rich people who often invest in universities and do so through financial instruments such as municipal bonds and other forms of bonds that universities issue. So which brings up the other issues, when you see star architecture in universities, or some fancy new building, whoever designed it, very often that's the product of, let's say it's a world, like recently I researched a building being done in a university of California that had just been funded by the largest grant in California university UC history. So they were like talking about this great $12 million grant. They're building a new building by Michael Maltson. They're also shutting down the sociology department because they didn't have enough money to run it. It's bizarre. You'd think that would be more important than building this new building. But the thing is that grant only covered, that $12 million grant was only 10% of the building's budget. The rest was going to be funded by municipal bonds, which then were relatively safe and then would be guaranteed by the future income from students, and thus kind of creates a financial instrument. So with all that said, I mean, it's in many ways it's important for us to be aware of our own positions within this, and to talk about these positions, that we aren't in a neutral place. We're in a place that has that's very much part of capital. But it allows us to say at least a little bit, allows us to do at least a little bit. And that I think that's very much the mission of an intellectual university.
I'll only add to that that I'm not a pessimist, but a healthily cynical optimist, will say. The only thing I'll add to that is that from where I'm standing and the way I see it, obviously I think we're all on the same page that deliberate opacity and obfuscation is in service to power and capital, right? That's sort of how it works. So increasing awareness becomes difficult. That is an uphill battle. I think it's important to understand that the individual awareness of how profit is generated through digital means is a small portion of a much larger structural condition, right? A cultural condition, a social condition, wherein individuals by and large do not understand, because we are not made privy to, because it's not readily accessible information and it's not transparently communicating, we do not understand how the financial structures, the financial mechanisms, the constant invention of new financial instruments, the financialization of our society, we do not understand how that happens, most of us. We saw, individual households, individual human beings get excited and feel upwardly mobile when they get, in 10, 15 years ago, as by the hundreds of thousands they were acquiring loans that they really couldn't afford, and we've got a word for it, it's predatory, and the sort of predatory financial actions again, like upon individuals happens on the internet as well. I think we see red flags every once in a while when the crises, when certain thresholds are crossed, but by and large, how our data is financialized and thus our activities are financialized is one part of a much larger question, which sounds dark. And I know we need to stop.
We need to stop.
We have the room for 15 more minutes or so maybe.
All right,
Randy, you want to?
I'd like to take up on something that Suki mentioned, which is going back to more local needs. You mentioned a local data center. You mentioned a data hub. I work for a technology company. We will have the technology to do that. But I'm interested in what you would say about the political tactics to make sure that this local data bubble is owned and organised by ourselves. And I'm thinking of the quantified self-influence, where the sensible way to do it would be to have it all locally, owned by you. And no, it goes to the cloud where they can sell advertising to you. Right? So how do we make sure that doesn't happen? And the other thing is, I can see this happening very nicely in Palo Alto and Columbia University in Soho. How do we make sure that this happens in Ouagadougou? How do we make sure that this happens in mountain villages?
I think that it might not be so hard in the latter case, to begin with the second part, in that, not that those places are necessarily underserved. In some ways they are. A mountain village may be. Lithuania, for example, where I have some connections and I'm a card-carrying Lithuanian. Actually, the net is faster than here, quite kind of interesting, precisely because they do have different models of it. But I think that, I think that let's say if we call this a kind of new local area networks to the nth degree, these, or the new BBS, I think that to some degree there has to be a cultural movement that would support the idea that these shouldn't be in the cloud. And, whether, I think there are certain things, certain bits of hardware out there that could make that work well, like Synology boxes. I don't know any stock in Synology. I want to advocate a company, but like Synology makes these great boxes that I connect up to my network. I've got 4 drives in it. I can run all sorts of stuff off there. Servers, it works faster than Dropbox. I can connect to it from anywhere in the world. I could run a web server. I could even run email off of that. Maybe we need to really, think about those kind of things over other kind, maybe more sexy or attractive forms of tech, like these things. So that's one thing, or that would be my response to both. I wonder if we can do this, if we can advocate for those through policy, whether there has to be a two-front battle. On the one hand, a battle against the top through policy, and on the other hand, a battle from the bottom up through culture. And when I think of the interest in maker culture now, that there's a lot of things we can critique about. At the same time, there's a certain reality to the excitement about it. I was just in Limerick, Ireland, which is a town that hasn't been doing very well, but the University of Limerick Architecture School set up a fab lab in the middle of town. And this is being seen very, very positively in town. That is, if you could go in there and you could make something. And nobody's going to own it, and it's not going up in the cloud unless you want it. Maybe little by little, those kind of models of thought can begin to take hold. Andrew, Astra?
Generating the political will for local ownership of
Yeah,
the
no,
internet. It's an enormously difficult question,
An example comes to mind of, he spoke about Chattanooga's municipal broadband, but they're also one of the few counties that has increasing library budgets, and they have another Filmmaker lab in their library. So these other, what public spaces could be occupied that are not being used, or maybe, need to be used in new ways now that the internet is upon us. So, using those as sites.
One real.
I think that's I think it's probably a significant and important insight. I'm working on a project right now with the Architectural League and Center for Urban Futures on reimagining or re-envisioning the branch library system in the city. And one thing that we realized is it really is, as a physical location, the library is one of the last standing, remaining, commonly understood civic spaces, properly public resources, and starting within the capital P public spaces that local areas have and can control in order to instigate those discussions, voice those needs, and as a way toward generating political will, maybe a strategy, or at least a tactic.
Yeah. I'd say of any group of people that's reached out to me about my book, it's librarians. Librarians who are really into digital culture
library
and
science
all this.
right now, yes.
They're very much wrestling with this.
Yeah, I mean, a parallel to librarians, if you think back, like what, and the public, the one place we haven't talked about the university. I think that one thing that as we're talking about all this, I'm thinking I have to go and do myself is really think also about schools, because one thing that's happened in schools today is that between the time that even many of the students have grown up, at least maybe the older students in the room, and today is that technology courses in grade school and high school have become oriented towards use of technology. So for example, how to be a podcaster, and that might actually be one of the more positive ones, but how to make a PowerPoint, as opposed, which actually kind of is like a template for creating the kind of PowerPoints that Edward Tufte would condemn. But instead of being what it was a long time ago, I mean, back in my day when we had ASR 33 teletypes and Data General mini computers, it was, you had a program. That's what technology class was. And it taught you about the infrastructure. To get that machine working, if the teacher hadn't come in yet in the morning, you needed to flip a bunch of binary switches. So in other words, learning a little bit about the guts of these machines, and what they do. And I think that's something really important that should happen not only in the university level, but also in the public schools, as opposed, and then along with that, these questions of ownership access and who controls should be brought up. Because schools are getting so obsessed now with talking about privacy and they're very concerned about sexting and what appears on Facebook. Then rightly they should be concerned about teaching, but they should also be concerned about teaching who owns this stuff. And I think that that's something that we need to maybe instill in find some grassroots way of dealing with that with our schools.
I also think that individuals are the point at which I think the effects of various network changes or networked culture changes of our networked culture are going to be felt most strongly or more startlingly is with the continued development of the Internet of Things, with the pulling of data from the private sphere, from the domestic sphere. When the domestic scale starts to get reorganized, the way the urban scale has been reorganized, I want to imagine that critical need of the reorganization of our lives is going to be inevitable.
We have to turn the room over to the next speaker. So thank you very much. Thanks for asking.
The books are ad and DRM free.
They're what?
Ad and DRM free.
Remember
The old open paper model.
It's like I need to do the certification ad free. put a sticker on it.
Is it ad-free?
Advertise it as ad-free.